Well, as a young boy, one of the Christmas presents I used to enjoy receiving was quite a random one, but it was the Guinness World Book of Records. In it, you would find a list of different world records that had been set that given year. For example, you would see things like the world's tallest man or the world's strongest woman. You would also have some random ones, like the guy with the longest fingernails. And as a young boy, I used to love reading through these books to ask myself this question: what would it take to break a world record? And in this passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, the Apostle Paul answers the question, not what would it take to break a world record, but what would it take to break the marriage covenant between a husband and a wife. In this passage, Paul's going to give us one example of something which does break the marriage covenant, and one example of something which doesn't break the marriage covenant. Look firstly with me in verses 8 and 9, an example of something which does break the marriage covenant. The Apostle Paul says this: "To the unmarried and the widows I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion." You might remember that in this section of 1 Corinthians chapter 7, the Apostle Paul has been addressing various categories of people within the church. He spoke to the married couples, and then most recently he spoke to the singles. And in verse 8 he continues speaking to the singles, but he also incorporates specifically the widows. And the first thing Paul really says in verse 8 is affirming the message we saw yesterday: singleness is good. Singleness is good. Look what Paul says: "It is good for them to remain single," referring to the widows. It is good for them to remain single. So Paul says singleness is good. But while singleness is good, verse 8, and verse 9 he also says marriage is good. And so if you're single or you're a widow and you desire to remain single, that is good. But if you desire to get married, particularly if you cannot control your urges, that too is good. And so to answer our initial question, what does it take to break the marriage covenant? Here the Apostle Paul gives us one clear example. The death of your spouse frees you from the marriage covenant. If your spouse, your husband or your wife has died, the marriage covenant in God's eyes is broken, and so you are free to remarry someone else. That's why at wedding ceremonies we say, "Till death do us part." Paul really emphasizes this again at the very end of chapter 7. You can see in verse 39 to 40 it says this: "A wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives, but if her husband dies, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. Yet in my judgment she is happier if she remains as she is, and I think that I too have the Spirit of God." The Apostle Paul clearly giving us one example of something which does break the marriage covenant: the death of your spouse. But then he moves on to give us one example of something which doesn't break the marriage covenant. Let's pick up the reading from verse 10 and 11. "To the married I give this charge, not I but the Lord: the wife should not separate from her husband. But if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and the husband should not divorce his wife." It's really important to remember two pieces of critical context to really understand what the Apostle Paul is saying in these two verses. The first thing to remember is that Corinth at this time was under Roman rule. And part of Roman rule was that divorce was very, very easy to obtain. In fact, if you just left your wife, effectively you were as good as divorced in that culture. The opposite, of course, is true in our culture. To get divorced is a lengthy process. You have to go through a lot of paperwork. You have to get solicitors involved. It's long, it's difficult, it's arduous. But in the Roman law, the complete opposite was true. Getting a divorce was easy. And that's the rule under which these Corinthians are living. But the second piece of context to remember is what we saw right at the beginning of chapter 7, and it's this. The Apostle Paul in this letter is actually responding to a previous letter that the Corinthians wrote him. And so as he writes chapter 7, he's dealing with some misconceptions that the Corinthian believers have come to believe. You might remember one of those misconceptions in verse 1 of chapter 7, where they said that sex was effectively evil. Sex should be something that no one engages in, even if you're married. And so what appears to be happening here is that the Corinthian believers are going around telling the married couples, you should separate from each other because you'll then not be tempted to have sex. And so what does the Apostle Paul say? He says, verse 10, no, that is crazy. Under these circumstances, look what the Apostle Paul says. To the married I give this charge: the wife should not separate from her husband. Paul says, in God's eyes, leaving your husband or your wife for those frivolous reasons does not break the marriage covenant. Those are not valid grounds to break the marriage covenant. The marriage covenant is still intact with your spouse. And so in that case, if you were to leave your husband under conditions which God says is not valid, and then you were to go and remarry someone else, look at verse 11, you would be guilty of committing adultery. Why? Because the marriage covenant with your original spouse in God's eyes is still intact. And so you would be guilty of adultery in God's eyes. It's really important to see that this is the very specific issue that the Apostle Paul is dealing with. He's not writing a comprehensive, exhaustive manual on the biblical principles for divorce and remarriage. In order to get that, you can't really go to one specific Bible passage. You need to kind of take a multiple number of Bible passages in the New Testament which address this issue. Matthew 19, Mark chapter 10, this passage in 1 Corinthians 7. But the Apostle Paul here is dealing with the Corinthian believers who have separated over this frivolous issue. He doesn't even mention, for example, things like adultery, which are mentioned in the other passages in the New Testament regarding divorce, because Paul's not burdened to talk about adultery here. It's not the issue that he's dealing with. And so the Apostle Paul's big idea here is this: marriage is sacred, the marriage covenant is strong, and a frivolous issue like this, believing a lie that's not found in the Bible, is not a valid ground to separate from your partner. It does not break the marriage covenant, even if the Roman rule under which you live says that it does. And so here's your challenge for today. We too live in a society whose values regarding marriage do not reflect the Bible's values of marriage. And so why don't you take the time to think about some of the married couples that you know? Maybe your parents, your grandparents, your aunties, uncles, cousins, friends. Why not take time to pray for them? And after you've prayed for them, why not pray for our land? Pray that our land would come to a fresh appreciation of God's good design for marriage. Hope you have a good day.